Chapter 5. Time continued to stagger forwards, with only the ships in the distance showing any change as they wiggled closer, with all the men still and watchful. The movement was like a swarm of jittery insects that crept and crawled, with a deluge of slime that trailed behind them in the waters. They began landing along the beach with no consideration for their own safety. It was chaos. They acted like animals spurred on, like an overwhipped pack of dogs. The previous night they didn't seem to expect much resistance, but this night they came prepared. John Vin narrated as the time flashed ahead, with the events moved forward to the moment the first ships landed on the beach. Each ship crammed to capacity with thousands of yelling trolls. They recklessly leapt off the ships only to receive a generous reception of arrows, which hailed down upon them from above. John Vin pointed along the cliff ledge to a line of men clad in hardened battle armor. Some parts of their armor were tarnished black with troll blood from the night before, others still had gleaming parts still peeking through. They began to work with a fantastic speed as they charged their tesseracts and dilated their temporal progression. They rained arrows down on the attacking trolls. Some of the trolls did not even register an arrow as it pierced them. Most seemed to require several arrows or one extremely well-placed shot to stop them. Hundreds of normal soldiers in tattered and worn tunics ran amongst the men, delivering repositories of arrows to the blurred forms. Ships, with their cargo of troll soldiers now impaled on the blood-soaked beach, pushed away to make room for more ships and more cargo. A fresh supply of targets took up position and began unloading with no care or remorse to the site laid before them. 5 ships maintained their positions outside the reach of the arrows, each with a collection of robed figures covered in a gruesome array of garnishes. Odd-shaped bones and half-rotten human body parts covered the troll shamans as they began chanting in unison. Elemental energy collected within each troll shaman group for an unknown purpose. The chanting in one of the ships stopped, and in a flash of light, the energy flared in front of them. A fireball formed and launched towards the archers on the cliff top. The other ships chanting also halted suddenly, to leave an eerie whistling sound of arrows that shrieked through the air as the noise of successive fireballs grew louder upon the cliff. The chanting troll shamans resumed their efforts as the process repeated. Caught off guard, the first blast exploded in the midst of 2 of the energetic archers. The blast sent them and the men that carted the fresh supply of arrows nearby skywards. Several of the blades, intermittently along the line, forfeited bows for swords. They met the fiery missiles head-on, each deflected them downwards into the advancing trolls below on the beach. In a violent discharge of energy, troll flesh, sinew, and bone tore asunder as the horde of trolls and fireballs met. The trolls continued the advance despite the heavy losses. The ridges of the dead started to provide cover from the arrows. The slow advance continued until the caravan of valuable arrows to the blades on the cliff top stopped. The trolls, unhindered by the steady barrage, closed the gap to the slope that ascended to the meadow and towards the city. John Vin immediately led 2/3 of the blades to obstruct them. The remaining blades stayed with Arabine and continued to fire the last reserves of arrows. Arabine began to dream-weave barrels full of arrows for the other blades to continue the assault, but it took him time and much effort to place the needed anima details together before his animus would set into reality. John Vin and his blades stood before the coming squall of huge trolls. He drew his large single-edged transcendent sword and grasped it before him in a salute to the troll horde. From John Vin's example, the air filled with the song of transcendent swords as they woke from slumber. The 2 sides crashed together. Rather than being hammered back by the force of the trolls, the blades parted. They sidestepped and forged into the throng, with the gargantuan trolls left to pass by them. The defense looked overwhelmed, with trolls breaching the entire line. But with a detailed eye, Valorian saw that those trolls that made it through the line trickled through to come to a stop. The trolls all dropped as they passed by the blades, with torsos cleaved in 2, limbs lopped off, and their bodies sliced open. A few headless bodies ran on hacking wildly unbeknownst of their own deaths. Jonvin spearheaded the blades, with Murdoch on his left and Trox on his right. Into the horde of mindless cattle they advanced to escalate the manic slaughter with each step forward. Shouts of warning, followed by screams, came from the city behind them. Valorian tracked the gaze of the robed image of his father's imprint. Jonvin's imprint looked behind them. Several hundred trolls landed further away and closed in undetected while the battle on the beach consumed our attention, his father's imprint said, directing Valorian's attention towards the cliff's ledge and the blades still there. Arabian and 6 other blades were all that remained of the contingent. The rate of arrows loosed upon the trolls was greatly diminished. A single blade danced back and forth before them, with his transcendent sword swinging as he panted wildly, all his effort just to fend off the fireball bombardment from the troll shamans. Arabian responded with lightning speed to the attack on the city. A full quiver of arrows fizzed and shivered into existence as the animus energy settled into Arabian's anima concept. The Dreamweave appeared to shimmer as it coalesced into reality attached to his back as he grabbed a bow. With a crack of elemental energy, he charged his tesseract to match speeds Valorian had seen Tililam regularly use, but much faster than the other blades here. He knocked and loosed all the arrows before him as he started to jog back to the city. The space around him gradually saturated with arrows as he started to gain ground on them. Wriggling through the air, the arrows flew beside him as Arabian matched his temporal progression with them. The arrow shafts contorted and writhed in quick wavy movements around him. Arabian skipped across the surface of the meadow in a bombardment of one. He slowed himself so he could move at the steady speed of the arrows. The bow tumbled across the ground as he cast it aside to free him to clear his transcendent sword from its scabbard with fluid movement. As Arabian drew nearer, he began constructing chaotic dreamweaves of disruptive reality. The air filled to bursting as the dreamweaves added to the torrent of arrows. The dreamweaves fell behind Arabian and the arrows as he formed them. The neo-reality stabilized into regular time to turn still and hang in the air, seeming stiller as Arabian increased his speed. The attack was devastating to the trolls. Arrows struck along their flank as the column approached the city. Each arrow's flight had force enough to burrow through several of the enemy number before it shattered. Arabian spun into their ranks like a hurricane. He hacked in circles as he yelled with a fury, his emotions fueled by the outrage for the nearly successful tactic. The sudden attack stunned the trolls. Doe-eyed looks searched around confused as they sought a source of suitable scale to merit the devastation. The chaotic dreamweave barrage forced more disarray upon them as a blitz of simultaneous explosions and implosions finally reached the trolls. Troll flesh tore apart and squashed together as it encountered Arabian's malice-given magical form. 1 or 2 trolls managed to scale the walls into the city before Arabian took up position between the advancing trolls and the fortification. Arc after arc of liquid blades slashed into their foremost ranks. Arabian's sword flashed like a ribbon that coiled in the air as he leapt into them. He delivered flying kicks as his sword swung, smashing skulls and caving in chests. Rebounding from quarry to quarry, the silver ribbon of his blade carved apart all that entered its path. He dived horizontally through the air. As he passed between 2 trolls he rotated to cut both of the surprised victims in 2, right down the middle, coming to rest with his sword impaled in the chest of a third burly troll. He finished with a quick twist of the blade to sever all the strength in the creature's body. The troll seemed bewildered. In its last moments it looked to its limbs and pleaded with them to kill, even as it dropped to its knees before Arabian. It begged the arm that held its mighty club to smash the human. Arabian placed his foot against the troll's chest and casually withdrew his transcendent sword. Valorian magnified Arabian's sword in his vision, drawing it into his eyes like drinking in the sight. It had a rapier-long thin look to it, but the blade structure was what attracted his gaze so intently. The blade seemed like any other blade, but when Arabian used it, A strange flux cavorted along the length. The blade edge moved in cascading waves, resembling wavy flames running along the edge from the hilt to the tip. "You wouldn't see an elf with a sword like that?" Jonvin remarked with a smile as he noticed Valorian's fascination. The Flamberg style, very hard to make into a transcendent blade, but Arabine was always very good at hard things. Not just beautiful to look at either. The constantly fluctuating form along the blade edge has a real function. During a parry, you can really disturb an opponent's technique. It sends a series of rattling oscillations along the opposition blade edge. Be forewarned, it rattles your bones loose if you're not prepared for it. Also good for absorbing a great deal of the attacking energy. It breaks it down, deflecting the leading edge away incrementally. I asked about it once. The elves said it was an overconsumption of energy and not practical, so I just let it be, Valorian said with his eyes wide with intrigue, drinking in every feature of the Flamberg-style blade. Well, that'll teach you to not test others' assertions. But, they're right in a way. It certainly is impractical. For an elf. Jonvin remarked whilst he simultaneously took a jibe against the elves. But, you're not an elf, are you? Jonvin posed the thought, only to leave it for Valorian alone to answer, as he returned his attention back to Arabine in the midst of an outraged pack of trolls. Valorian took a quick look behind him, to gaze at the site of the main confrontation on the beach briefly. Casualties continued to increase amongst the blades as they persevered against the manic trolls and the ruthless numbers sent mindlessly to be killed against superior abilities. Valorian sensed the fizzing of animus around Arabine as he turned back. The trolls clambered over their hued comrades, ever screaming murderous intentions as they closed in on the solitary seething form at the center of their wrath. Large, grotesque and somewhat stupid, pigs to the slaughter, Jonvin's imprint said with blatant admiration for Arabine. The trolls raced to their doom. None noticed as gradually members of their complement were snatched up into the air. Trolls whipped violently around as they whirled upwards in an invisible carousel. Limbs began to rip off the trolls like insects being picked apart. The remains Arabine vaporized into a shower of dust and weaponry. Arabine closed his eyes and lowered his sword. His concentration became totally focused on controlling his penteract and directing the dream-woven reality that tore into the diminishing troop of trolls. As the dust settled, Arabine looked back to the city. Unruly lighting danced across the battlements, indicating fighting beyond, with the clanking of metal and men shouting readily confirmed that trolls had managed to enter the city. The noises from the city paled in comparison to all the screams from the battle on the beach. Arabine weighed each fight against the other, with only a mild ruckus drifting out of the city. It was an easy decision to make. Arabine turned away from the city and with a mighty temporal lunge he sailed across the meadow towards the raging skirmish below on the beach. Who was the better warrior between the two of you? Valorian asked his father's imprint as they turned to follow Arabine's glide towards the beach, his light feet skirting over the ground, his sword still held ready in his hand. Arabine, Jonvin stated blandly, with no hesitation or emotion, a simple fact, simply said. Arabine reached the end of the meadow and stood before the slope down to the beach. The cliff top was vacant, any blades to join. Only a few common soldiers with crossbows fired in vain. He looked into the melee with a calculating stare, even as the sound of the chaotic conflict almost deafened him and the stench of death turned his stomach. He measured the situation with a calm mind. Valorian watched Arabine scan the scene before him, wondering what he was thinking as he ground his teeth in fury. Amongst the carnage, hundreds upon hundreds of common soldiers lay mutilated by the lifeless remains of his brother blades. Only a dozen blades remained. They fought side by side with the common soldiers. Pikes stabbed as shields were pummeled. The defense force barely with enough strength to sidestep the blows before they backpedaled away from another attack. Murdoch and Trox screamed in blind desperation as they hacked and slashed with as much skill as novice woodsmen. Despite their fraught efforts, they were merely dealing with the scraps left from Jonvin's exacting butchery ahead of them. Jonvin stood alone, but fought like a legion. He still held the original defense point. He moved like a phantasmic form that waged quality against quantity in a brutal grace. In a bloody mist of personified rage, liquid blade blinked in and out of sight to chop and slice troll bodies apart. Entire clusters of advancing trolls ignited in flashes of blazing heat. Bright threads of lightning jumped from Jonvin's body and burrowed deep into troll chests like blinding hot whips. The advancing trolls had their comrades hurled at them. The twisted and mangled bodies collided and fell lifeless at the feet of the ever-preceding mass of trolls. Arabine crouched, with a visible impression that pushed into the ground as he launched himself into the air towards Jonvin's bastion. He landed just in front of Jonvin. Bao on his knees before the mass of trolls, a shockwave of raw potent animus detonated outwards to halt the trolls. With a blinding fury, Arabine swept the ardent pulsing waves of his transcendent sword out in a horizontal arc. In just one liquid blade slice, 300 paces of the beach was swept clear of aggressors in a flashing slash of metallic death. Upper and lower halves of trolls separated in a slow and hostile divorce. The horde of trolls dropped noisily in a cascading wave of successive thuds. Arabine and Jonvin were given a clear view before them as row after row toppled. Stupefied trolls on the edge of the slaughter retreated as they grasped the scale of the attack. They looked at each other for someone to establish a course of action, with screams of agony from their eviscerated brethren giving them over to indecision. Valorian took a quick glance at his father's imprint beside him. He saw a smirk appear on his face with an appreciating nod towards Arabine's swordsmanship. Arabine slowly rose to his full height to stand with Jonvin. Jonvin stood covered in troll blood. His armor stained black with all his slaughtering labor. He strode to Arabine's side over the remains of all the fallen trolls. His footing was sure and steady despite the uncertain terrain. Jonvin's dark chaotic form when placed beside Arabine's still gleaming armor presented quite the contrast. A mangled arm reached through the gore underfoot, snatching hold of Jonvin's greave-armored leg. Without much of any reaction from Jonvin, the wounded troll screamed loudly in some fiendishly applied torment. The bloodied troll levitated from the ground. Jonvin's animus tore the troll into pieces whilst all the other trolls could only watch in horror. Behind his side-lapping face guard, an incensed Jonvin stared out, his cheeks shuddered as his eyes narrowed then broadened. His gauntleted hand tightened and loosened his grip on his sword. The action betrayed the longing for more violence as his sword appeared to miss the feel of trolls slicing apart. Standing toe-to-toe against an army of trolls, neither warrior even blinked. With a swell of determination brewing, the frothing line of trolls began to edge forwards. As they were about to resume their attack, a series of loud twangs resonated in the air to halt the beasts. The signal came from a large brass gong that hung from the rafters of the largest shaman ship. The ship was landing on the beach alongside the other troll shaman ships. These trolls did not recklessly leap off like the soldiers. Instead, they disembarked in an orderly fashion. The troll soldiers seemed to know what was coming and began to separate, pulling their dead with them, to form a pathway straight to Jonvin and Arabine. The gong sounded again as the troll shamans reached the front ranks. A second gong signaled and they all suddenly parted to form a channel of troll shamans that led to the two blades. The quieting ring from the gong faded so the sound of the crashing waves could be heard for the first time that night, like a new sound unaccustomed to the place. But with the sound of the waves came the tide of the aftermath as all the many unsettling battle sounds filled the air. A rhythmic pace of loud thuds drew the attention of the blades towards the lead ship. A colossal troll emerged from the bowels with a large jagged headdress. Skulls and bones from various creatures riddled about the complex antenna-like crown, It made for a sight that only knew how to worship slaughter, for which this was the altar. The imposing troll carried a bulky polished white animal skull, with great fangs protruding from its upper jaw. In his other hand, he gripped a crooked and gnarled staff covered in red tassels that streamed out like ribbons of blood. The Troll King, Jonvin's imprint announced to Valorian. Betraying an assortment of defeated postures, Trox, Murdoff, and the rest of the blades were barely able to respond to the sight, leaning forward and panting. Some started to collapse to their knees on the ground, or cradle themselves only to moan at pains just becoming apparent in the moment of calm. They fought through the exhaustion and made a move to unite with Arabine and Jonvin. Arabine twisted around and signaled for them to remain where they were. They complied without protest as the commanding presence of the Troll King finally disembarked the ship and walked to the head of his devastated army. The column of troll shamans closed in behind the Troll King as he passed them in a well-organized manner. The king of all trolls. This was the first time in known history he had ever taken part in an invasion not involving elves. Jonvin's imprint informed Valorian of the significance. Only 1,000 or so soldier trolls remained, their decimated numbers reinforced by the few hundred troll shamans that joined them. All suddenly turned to the Troll King as the crowd of troll shamans stretched their arms out towards their well-garnished king. Arms began shaking in fits and convulsions as they mustered the energy to their leader's bidding. A low mumble built into a loud malevolent chant, which helped them coordinate the gathering of magical energy. The chant seemed to enrage Jonvin and Arabine. So many blades lay dead because of the troll vermin, and the two unflinching warriors silently swore revenge. Arabine's and Jonvin's anger found its own voice, each answered the chant with thunderous battle cries. Valorian felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. Human soldiers and the remaining blades looked to each other in shared unease. The grains of sand on the beach hopped and shuddered, unstable rocks fell from the cliff face. The animus energy built in intensity, whilst a rich aura of anima flowed like a beam of light from Arabine and Jonvin towards the Troll King. With no warning from a change in chant or directed movement, a compression wave of violent force was projected from the Troll King's magic. The blast surged towards Arabine and Jonvin. Neither blade made any attempt to move or protect themselves. The invisible force flicked blood-spattered troll remains left and right, as it tunneled through the viscera directly towards the two blades. Just as ocean waves crashed against a rock face, the energy met the power of the blades with an unmoving reply. A translucent wall of crackling animus appeared to disperse the energy with a steel indifference. Undeterred, the Troll King blanketed more destruction against the blades. He launched destructive energy that now dissipated the moment it formed. Arabine and Jonvin worked together effortlessly to render the attacks useless. The chanting increased as the troll attack shifted to defense. Several shamans abruptly spurted blood out from the deep recesses of their hoods before they crumbled to the ground. The weakest shamans dropped first, overpowered by the onslaught of dream-weaving and dream-casting by the two blades. The revving chant increased to breaking point with every member the chorus lost from its number. Gusts of whipping wind rushed around the beach and surrounding cliff face. It signaled a shifting of elemental forces, the elements being thrown out of balance as the magic clashed. Valorian recognized the signs of imbalance with ease, after having caused so many such elemental imbalances over the years in an attempt to learn the elfin ways of magic. Valorian squinted his eyes as grains of sand enriched the gale. Wandering fragments of elemental earth attracted the matter to throw a great weight behind the dancing winds. The dense sandy squalls obscured the figures as it coalesced into a cyclone around them. As quickly as it had formed, it disappeared with a harsh blast of force. An enchanted yell sprang from the salivating mouth of the Troll King to cast out dark magic. A cleansing swipe of power swept away the sandstorm with a harsh blast of force. Manconio Jutakit, the Troll King could be heard shouting this time as he stabbed the end of his gnarled staff into the ground. Before the Troll King, another nullifying quake spread outwards to wash away the oppressive offensive forces gathered by the blades. Arabine and Jonvin were jolted by the force, but kept their footing. The fanged animal's skull began to glow in the Troll King's hand. It caused the air to bristle with anticipation like a forecasting of a deadly attack to come. The blades defended with an attack. Blood-curdling battle cries appeared to feed a shroud of energy that built around them. Arcs of lightning leapt off them in a release of pent-up wrath. The anger fueled an ever-increasing energy that grew and grew. The force seemed to have no end as it gathered and accumulated without ceasing. The blade's energy amassed faster and grew larger. The Troll King appeared displeased as he turned to each side with only irritation and disappointment for the shamans. He fed all that annoyance into a white-hot lance of energy that he hurled towards the blades. Arabine and Jonvin worked seamlessly together to give a reply. A pure white pillar of energy sprang from them to slam against the Troll King's attack. Sparks and flickers of deadly energy made the land shudder as each force attempted to drill through the other. The opposing energies appeared to be equal until Arabine leant into his attack. He produced a more ferocious wail and the leading edge of the two energy lances began to burrow closer towards the Troll King. Spurred on by Arabine, Jonvin released all he had left to give. The shamans began to drop rapidly. The exertion overwhelmed them. Abruptly, the blade's energy lance swallowed the troll's dwindling energy. Fractions of the blade's raw animus energy breached their defensive shields. Energy cracked and whipped as it slashed amongst them, bursting the hooded troll shamans into vapors of dark spray, like popping bubbles of crude oil. The Troll King's staff and animal skull creaked and moaned like an earthquake deep underground. It absorbed the vast quantities of energy in a desperate move to curb the assault. The Troll King's magical objects exploded. Each horrid thing reached the extent of energy it could contain. The blast disintegrated both of the Troll King's arms and tore open his chest in an eviscerating discharge. The Troll King was plowed backwards into the sand. The sudden break in activity gave the battle scene a hallowed silence. Valorian watched on as the troll soldiers slowly comprehended the loss of the confrontation and the impossible fall of their invincible leader. Arabine and Jonvin started towards them, each step nervously matched by the gradually back-pedaling troll army. Each shuffle made a retreat into the blood-saturated waves of the sea. Arabine stopped before the king of all the trolls. He looked down at the mutilated body surrounded by the gory flesh from others of his race. The indomitable king looked out of astonished darkened eyes that were still unable to fathom his situation of defeat. The soldier trolls, and the surviving troll shamans began to look at each other. Each tried to decide on what to do about the blades and the safety of their leader. None, however, overcame the fear that rendered them utterly powerless. "Well, here he is, the great lord of all trolls. May I assist you to rise, king of trolls?" Arabine mocked as he reached out his hand to the armless regent. "Tell us, how do the spoils of your plunder look from down there, O great one?" Arabine continued to taunt. The entire time his words barely hid the snarl of anger that pulled at his lips. Arabine reached out with his animus and plucked the defeated foe from the sand. An invisible giant animus hand wrapped around the crippled plunderer. The Troll King hung in the air limply before them, unable to offer resistance. "Troll!" Arabine's voice boomed across the beach. The force of his voice resounded off the cliffs. The words ingrained with animus and laced with anima, all ears could hear, and all minds would understand. "For the crimes you have committed these nights, I, Arabine Messalin, and Jonvin Wellentine, Knights of Clendoran, Blades of Elanan, sentence you to death. No more shall your kind prey on the helpless and the weak, for we now stand your enemy." He turned to Jonvin, who stepped forward without prompting. With Jonvin's last step, he took a ruthlessly precise slice. The Troll King's head toppled from his shoulders. The headdress stabbed into the ground with the Troll King's head displayed upside down before the trolls. A few among the troll number cried out in protest at the ruination of their leader. but under the ferocious gaze of the two blades they quickly silenced their objections. Arabine released his animus grip on the decapitated body and left it to flop to the ground. The remains jerked and twitched. He pointed his sword at the demoralized trolls and then at the ground. Any troll that sets foot on these lands again will have his hide removed and rolled in salt. Arabine paused to make sure they understood. You all get one small chance to leave now. Go back to your land of filth as messengers, and tell all that fester there of this warning, and what happened here this day. I wouldn't be the last to leave, Jonvin threatened, his voice hoarse and raspy, with every syllable filled with hate. Anxious glances and fidgeting rustles preceded a distraught trample towards the sea. Many fell as they began to stampede towards the moored shaman ships. Only a small number of the troll shamans remained, the once respectful behavior towards them discarded in favor of self-preservation. Arabine and Jonvin stood inactive as they watched the frantic retreat. Their posture wavered on occasion following the sway of the ocean. They maintained the show of force to the backs of the trolls as each dove into the sea, attempting to swim across the mighty expanse to escape. The closest ships, already teeming with hordes of desperate trolls, began to weigh anchor at the banished commands of the captains. Jonvin tilted forwards and backwards as he tried to follow his view of the constantly wavering horizon. Trox appeared by Jonvin's side to catch him as he started to drop. Murdoch, Arabine beseeched as he dropped his transcendent sword and reached out for some needed support. Murdoch barely managed to shuffle to Arabine's aid and showed great effort from his wounds as he held both their weights. The rest of the remaining blades surrounded Arabine and Jonvin. Valorian looked at them. So few of their number had survived the battle, but each was now a furious blade. They stood on a carpet of utter mayhem and seemed at home. Gradually, the remnants of the battle faded away, the beach cleared from the aftermath of carnage to become an untouched canvas. I have only ever read of such battles, and none have shown such courage, Valorian complimented his father's imprint. You were both exhausted, and yet you managed to maintain the ruse just long enough, Valorian said smiling fondly. Valorian's mind was a horde of questions equaling the initial number of trolls in the battle, but he did not want to disturb his newfound calm, a calm not felt for many years. All the years spent in the constant struggle to suppress the unrelenting rage had left Valorian unwilling to disturb it. He was content to immerse himself in the events that had transpired in his father's life. It had been so long in confusion and anger, he had almost forgotten what his own thoughts felt like. They greeted him now like reuniting with a dear friend. Roar! A deep prolonged shudder permeated the entire landscape. A flutter of vibrations rattled in Valorian's chest. As before, the behemoth white lion heralded his approach with the heart-stopping harbinger. Valorian tried to remain composed despite his innate desire to leap off the cliff for escape. What should I do? Valorian asked in a panic to his father's imprint. Jonvin's imprint shrugged his shoulders limply in reply. Decide quickly, Jonvin warned as he flicked his chin in the direction of the now charging lion. Valorian looked around him for some kind of weapon. Nothing discarded from the battle remained. He sought help from his father's imprint again, but the image had vanished and left him alone to face the lion. Valorian weighed his panicked options, seriously reconsidering the jump of the cliff for the second time. He looked down as he glanced left and right, searching for an idea in his mind. None seemed to form, except the stupid type, attack. Absent a weapon and powers, it was a fickle tactic formed by a desperate soul. Valorian's head snapped up as he began to run in the poorly conceived counterattack. The lion's riposte was to quicken its own pace towards his delusional prey. A running pebble advanced towards a bounding avalanche. At the critical moment, the lion pounced and committed itself to tackle Valorian. Valorian had thought as much and dived forwards. Claws swished through empty air to pass over his head. Valorian rolled under the incensed beast, to return to his feet. He tried to present himself with confidence to his foe, even as he stepped casually away. The surprised lion quickly spun to face Valorian, with the silver mane pulled like a wash of pearlescent metallic flames behind its head. The prudent beast paused. Instead of revamping its attack, the mighty head ducked low and glided left to right as it began to reassess Valorian. The lion's deep azure eyes were charged with a vehement tempest as it stalked ever closer. The eyes made all manner of instinctive judgments with a carefully honed predatory vision. Valorian stopped backpedaling and stood still. So far being unpredictable had been the correct tact, but surprise was quickly becoming exhausted from his arsenal. Valorian knew that the lion's next attack would not be as aggressive, but more probing in nature. The lion circled Valorian, carefully testing for any sign of an evading movement. It tried to draw out a betraying nerve from his prey. With every stalking step, it was gradually becoming clearer just how overmatched Valorian was. The lion grew more assured towards another attack, with Valorian's meager affront of strength peeling away by the moment. The once stunned aggressor was slowly, but surely, losing all its prior hesitation. Valorian, unable to think of a single cogent option, waited in earnest reflection. This manner of situation had been played out time and time again in history. When a man faced a beast like this, alone and unarmed, the result was both obvious and inevitable. Then Valorian realized, this was not the real world, and perhaps the simple act of presenting a challenge could assert some symbolic authority in this completely unreal world. He forced himself to accept the belief, knowing that the thought was more real than the environment around him. The currency in such virtual places lay in symbols and metaphorical totems of power, not simple flesh or even a large clawed paw that could easily crush him. Valorian reconciled himself to the fact, the lion could only cause the sensation of pain, just the illusion of it, but just a sensation nonetheless. There was no actual harm from anything that the lion could do to him here. Valorian's gaze locked on to the lion in what he wanted to appear as conviction, but what he and the lion knew plainly as desperation. He lunged forwards towards the encircling lion, attempting a rabbit kick at an extremely unimpressed recipient. The massive form of the lion easily dodged the kick with deceptive speed, bouncing aside like a nimble cat. The lion swiped one of his enormous paws, with those large claws extended fully. If it had been in the real world, the blow would have ended the game for good. However, the game had only just begun. Pain seared through Valorian as the lion's strike gained no purchase on his flesh. Instead of making contact, the lion's paw spectrally continued through Valorian, leaving just the sensation of pain in its wake. Valorian collapsed to his knees on the grassy meadow. His back arched backwards as his eyes rolled to the back of his skull, mouth wide in a voiceless scream. His arms froze stiff with the sensation as his hands clawed the air, his whole body twitched and trembled in agony. An eternity seemed to pass as Valorian fell victim to the whim of a beast playing with a toy. It swiped high then low as Valorian tumbled around blindly, ever he searched for some means of escape. The lion repeatedly allowed Valorian an attempted getaway into the open meadow, only to vault directly into Valorian's path and resume the game. Eventually, in Valorian's timeless torment, mindless action replaced reason as he tried to shake free from his stalker. His vision blackened, and his consciousness retreated inward. The game ended as the pain drowned Valorian's mind, with his thoughts clinging wildly to the solace he could only find in the oblivion of quiet darkness.